There is an entire country, the largest country in Latin America, a country of over 200 million people, surrounded on almost every side by Spanish-speaking nations, sitting right in the heart of a continent called Latin America. And for most of its modern history, that country has not really considered itself Latin. That country is Brazil. And the artist who is currently making millions of Brazilians question that identity, reconsider that history, and flood social media with declarations of Latin belonging, a Puerto Rican rapper who performs entirely in Spanish, in a country where less than 1% of the population speaks Spanish fluently. If that doesn't sound like the setup to something much bigger than a concert announcement, shh, turn the volume up, but keep it low. This is Rap Deepest Secrets, the one place the labels can't control, exposing the codes, the cover-ups, the real cost of fame. Now back to the video. There is actually a saying in Brazil, and this is real, this is something Brazilians say about themselves, that Brazilians only realize they are Latin when they travel to the United States or Europe. Read that again slowly. The largest country in Latin America only feels Latin when it leaves Latin America. That is not a small cultural quirk. That is an identity gap so wide that researchers have actually studied and documented it. A survey conducted about a decade ago asked people across Latin America how they primarily identified themselves. The results across most of the continent were similar. The majority of people in most Latin American countries identified first as Latin American. In Brazil, 4%. 4%. While 79% of Brazilians said they identified first as Brazilian, and 13% said they identified as a world citizen before anything else. Only 4% called themselves Latin American first. That number is not just a statistic. That number is the entire backstory of why what is happening right now in Brazil is genuinely historic. The short answer is language. Brazil is the only country in Latin America where Portuguese, not Spanish, is the dominant language. That single difference created a cultural wall that has separated Brazil from its neighbors for generations. Shared geography, shared continent, shared history of colonization and struggle, but a language gap that made genuine cultural exchange harder than it sounds. And that language gap showed up in the music industry consistently. Spanish-speaking artists have historically struggled to break into Brazil's market in any significant way. There have been exceptions. Ricky Martin from Puerto Rico had moments, Shakira from Colombia had commercial success, but those were specific, contained breakthroughs, not movements, not identity shifts. Which is exactly what makes what Bad Bunny is doing right now so different. He is not just charting in Brazil, he is not just selling tickets, he is performing 2 consecutive sold-out nights at a football stadium in Sao Paulo, over 40,000 people each night, and he has not released a single song in Portuguese. He has not collaborated with any Brazilian artists. He has not done the traditional crossover into this market playbook that most international artists follow when trying to build a presence somewhere new. He just showed up as himself, and Brazil showed up for him. Experts who study music and culture in Brazil are pointing out something specific about this moment, something that separates it from the Shakira era or the Ricky Martin era. Those artists broke through in Brazil primarily through commercial routes, soap operas, radio-friendly collaborations, the kind of mainstream cultural infrastructure that smooths out an artist's edges and makes them palatable to the widest possible audience. Bad Bunny's path into Brazil was different. He broke through, according to researchers, as being in a way that is aligned with a more anti-American agenda of emancipation. That phrase, anti-American agenda of emancipation, is doing a lot of work. What it means in plain language is this. His appeal in Brazil is not about being catchy. It is about what he represents. And what he represents, to a significant segment of Brazilian fans, is a rejection of the idea that American culture is the default setting for everything worth consuming. Here is the layer of this story that nobody is fully connecting. Bad Bunny has been one of the most outspoken critics of the Trump administration's immigration policies. His Super Bowl performance, where he performed entirely in Spanish, named almost every country in Latin America and the Caribbean, including Brazil, and said, "God bless America," in a way that clearly redefined what America means, was a direct, public, unmistakable statement. Trump called it an insult. Brazil lost its mind, in a good way. Social media in Brazil was flooded after that Super Bowl performance with declarations of Latin identity. People who had never called themselves Latin American were suddenly saying, "Wait, he named us, he included us, he sees us as part of the same story." A left-wing congresswoman actually introduced a bill to grant Bad Bunny honorary Brazilian citizenship. The stated reason was that it would build another cultural bridge between Brazil and its Spanish-speaking sister nations. A politician introduced legislation because of a Super Bowl halftime show. If that doesn't tell the whole story about how deeply this man's presence is landing in Brazil, nothing will. But here's the part that researchers are pointing to as equally important. The Trump administration's tariffs and its attempts to interfere in Brazil's judiciary have inflamed Brazilian nationalism in a very specific way. Anti-American sentiment in Brazil has been rising, and into that rising sentiment walks an artist who is himself a very public symbol of resistance to American political pressure on Latin identity. The timing is not a coincidence. The context is not relevant. These things are connected. There is one specific moment from Bad Bunny's Super Bowl performance that went viral in Brazil in a way that is worth understanding fully. During the show, there was an image, a young boy sleeping across 3 chairs at a wedding. That image, for many Latin American families, regardless of language or country, is immediately recognizable. It is a scene from a specific kind of childhood, a specific kind of family gathering, a specific kind of cultural experience that crosses national borders, even when language does not.
Brazilians saw that image and said, "That's us. That's our experience. That's our story too." One fan administrator of a Brazilian Bad Bunny fan account, someone who manages the account as a volunteer, purely out of love for the artist, traveled 1,550 miles from the Amazonian city of Belém to Sao Paulo just to attend the concerts. That is not the behavior of someone who found an artist catchy. That is the behavior of someone who found something in an artist's work that felt like recognition. Bad Bunny brings a cultural weight, and we end up recognizing ourselves in his narrative, that fan said. That sentence is the entire thesis of what is happening in Brazil right now. This is the part of the story where a subscription to the channel becomes genuinely necessary, because this kind of analysis, connecting music, politics, identity, and global power shifts in real time, is exactly what this channel exists to do. Subscribe right now. The algorithm won't always put this in front of you. Make sure you don't miss what's coming next. Here is the detail in this story that should genuinely make everyone stop and think. Brazilians, by their own data, by their own surveys, by their own cultural self-description, have historically looked more toward the United States than toward their Latin American neighbors. Researchers who study this phenomenon have a name for it: American soft power. The idea that U.S. culture has been so heavily marketed to Brazil for so long, so consistently presented as the aspirational standard, that Brazilians have absorbed a kind of cultural orientation that points north rather than sideways toward their actual neighbors. Less than 1% of Brazilians speak Spanish or English fluently, and yet Anglophone artists, American and British artists, consistently outperform Spanish-language artists in Brazilian streaming numbers. All 5 of the most streamed foreign acts in Brazil are English language. Not one Spanish-language artist broke the top 10 most streamed artists overall in 2025. So the system was working exactly as designed. U.S. soft power was doing its job. Brazil was consuming American culture at a higher rate than it was consuming the culture of the countries literally on its borders. And then, Bad Bunny started filling football stadiums. Not by going through the American cultural pipeline, not by getting placed on US-approved playlists or collaborating with American artists to gain credibility in the Brazilian market, by being fully, unapologetically, non-negotiably himself, Puerto Rican, Spanish-speaking, politically outspoken, and completely uninterested in making himself easier to digest for audiences who might prefer something softer. He became the first non-Brazilian Latin artist to place a solo track, not a collaboration, a solo track, on Brazil's Billboard Hot 100. He said himself recently in an interview, "It moves me because I recognize that in Brazil, people listen more to Brazilian music, and I didn't even do something like collaborate with artists from there." He didn't play the game, and he won anyway. Strip the concert away, strip the streaming numbers away, strip the celebrity away for a second. What is actually happening in Brazil right now is a quiet, slow, but genuinely significant identity shift. A country that has spent generations defining itself in contrast to its Latin American neighbors, culturally, linguistically, politically, is starting to ask different questions, starting to look sideways instead of only north, starting to hear something in Spanish language music that sounds unexpectedly like home. That shift is not just about Bad Bunny. He is the visible point of it, but the shift is connected to something much larger, a growing global pushback against the idea that American cultural dominance is natural, inevitable, or permanent. The internet gave people access to other stories, other sounds, other ways of seeing the world, and some of those stories turned out to resonate more deeply than the ones that had been marketed to them since childhood. As one Brazilian researcher put it, and this is worth sitting with, the US culture has always been heavily marketed to us, promoting the so-called American way of life. Now, because of the internet, we have access to other things as well, and we are seeing the emergence of a Latin way of life. A Latin way of life. Not as a reaction to American culture, not as a political protest, as a genuine, organic, people choosing it for themselves cultural emergence. And the artist at the center of that emergence performed entirely in Spanish, named Brazil from a Super Bowl stage, and is now selling out football stadiums in Sao Paulo 2 nights in a row. There is something poetic and something deeply suspicious, in the best way, about the fact that the artist waking up Brazilian Latin identity is not Brazilian, does not speak Portuguese, has never collaborated with a Brazilian artist, has never done any of the things that conventional music industry logic says you need to do to break into a new market. He just told his truth, in his language, about his people. And in doing that, in being so specifically himself, he somehow made millions of people in a country thousands of miles away feel specifically seen. That is not a marketing strategy. That is not a streaming algorithm at work. That is culture, doing what culture actually does when it's real, crossing borders that politics and language and industry logic said couldn't be crossed. Brazil is remembering its Latin, and Bad Bunny didn't even try to make that happen. If this story landed, if something in it shifted how you see music, identity, or what's actually happening in the world right now, the channel deserves a subscription. This is the kind of content that lives here. Real stories, real connections, real analysis without the noise. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to see it, and stay tuned, because this is only the beginning of a much bigger conversation. See you on the next one.